Welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us to talk about food waste, food recovery, and what schools can do. I'm going to ask you please to mute your phone or your computer. You can ask us questions during this webinar by typing your questions into the chat box, and we will try to get to all the questions in the time that we have and post your answers to all the questions that you type, even if we don't get to them afterwards, and share them with you. This webinar is being recorded, and we will send you the link to the recording so you can listen to it again if you'd like to. One more thing about logistics. If you did not register through the ordinary means and you just got on today by just clicking onto Adobe Connect, that's fine. Thank you for joining us. But we'd really appreciate it if you could just type your email address into the chat box so that we can send you information afterwards. So my name is Martha Shields. I'm the director of the New England Environmental Finance Center. Our center's mission is to help communities find ways to finance the critical environmental programs that they'd like to pursue. Food recovery is just one of our programs. We also have programs that help communities with climate change adaptation and stormwater management programs. This webinar is supported by a Healthy Communities grant from EPA Region 1. When you registered for this webinar, we asked you to tell us why you were interested in the topic of food recovery and composting. And your responses indicate that there is no doubt that you want to take action and to do something about food waste that you see at your school every day. So this is a really exciting movement, and it's gotten a lot of attention lately. And based on our registration data, we have lots of people tuning in to this really progressive and new thing that schools are starting to do. Today in our audience, we have representatives from 36 school districts in Maine, mainly in Maine. We have some out-of-staters. We have teachers, custodians, cooks, kitchen managers, food service directors, and green team and environmental club members. We are excited that schools want to step and take an action and stop throwing leftover food in the trash and learn more about the programs that are there to recover food, whether that is setting up a share table or using a composting station that we will talk about today. So primarily this webinar is for Maine. We have some out-of-state people joining us in, and we know that Maine is geographically spread out, and it can sometimes prevent us from connecting, like in a network, where we can really learn from each other. One of our goals for the two webinars that we're doing, first part today, second part October 20th, is to create an email network. And if you choose to participate, you can use the network to stay in touch with schools all across the state that are tuning in, who have common commitments and barriers to starting these programs, and we can share our stories. We'll talk about that more at the end of this webinar. Another thing I'd like to say before we start on the presentation is if we're really interested in your stories. We want to know what your story is for any barriers or problems that you've had. If you've been trying to set up a share table or a composting program, we'd love it if you could share it with us, and what we will do is share it with the bigger group at our next webinar. So let's get started. Today we have Susan Webster with us. She has a lot of experience assisting schools, setting up food separation stations, and advising them on food recovery strategies. Susan has probably heard every so-called barrier to setting up waste reduction programs in schools, and she and I will both tell you that there has not ever been a barrier that we couldn't solve. So take heart, and we are here to share our stories with you, and here is Susan Webster.
Thanks, Martha. Hello, and thanks for joining us today to talk about food waste and food recovery. I guess we want to start out by saying that leftover food has really gotten a bad rap. A lot of people think of it as trash, but we have to remember that it's food, and we have to remember that food in a landfill or in an incinerator is wasted food. And that's not what its prime destination should be. These are some facts on wasted food, no matter, I mean, I'm sure that a lot of you are really familiar with these statistics, but they still are impressive, and they still make us think about what exactly is going on with putting food in a landfill. The fact that food is the single largest municipal waste source in a landfill, the fact that 40% of food produced is wasted, the fact that that leftover food is producing methane, which is contributing to global warming. Those are facts that everybody needs to know and keep in mind and understand why we need a solution. Food recovery, or some people also call it food rescue, this practice can take place in a farm, at a restaurant, a supermarket, at schools. It means that that food, which is usually edible, instead of going into the trash, it goes to a better purpose. We love this quote. It's simple and it tells the story in 5 words. Let's feed people, not landfills. And you can see here that the impact of food recovery is substantial. Either food is eaten, food can be composted, but the overall impact is that food waste is prevented. So these 3 statistics sort of give us the motivation to take action. What would happen if we took leftover food out of the landfills? Well, we were impressed to find out that it would be the same thing as taking 25% of all cars in America off the road. It would mean that even if we diverted 15% of that food that's currently going to a landfill, we would be able to cut the number of food insecure Americans in half. And we'll be talking a little bit more about food insecurity later on. And the last campaign, while it sounds pretty humorous, being the Ugly Fruit and Vegetable campaign, this would make a huge difference to farmers who now have to choose what they can take to market based on what their produce looks like. EPA has gotten very seriously into food recovery. It's one of their commitments. And they produced this food recovery hierarchy. As you can see, it starts from the most preferred destination for food all the way down to the least preferred, which, as you can imagine, is landfill and incineration. We're going to talk about how schools can tie into these different end destinations. And what's really interesting is that EPA and USDA are partnering to set a food waste reduction goal for 2030, which amazingly is only 14 years away. They want to cut food waste by 50%. They have 2 major goals: improve overall food security and conserve resources. And both the EPA and the USDA support schools to participate in this program. There's information about the details about the Food Recovery Challenge and Food Waste Challenge in the resource section that we'll talk about at the end. So now, this is why we're all here today. What can schools do? Many of you, as we were talking about earlier, looking at the food recovery hierarchy, these are the ways that schools can hook in to the different levels of the hierarchy. Starting from the top, the source reduction, which is obviously has the biggest impact. Our offer versus serve program, we've lost the serve there, I noticed. That means that it will actually, the food won't even end up on someone's tray, which means it loses the potential possibly to go into the trash. Feeding hungry people can be met by setting up share tables or donating food. Coming down to feeding animals. If you're collecting leftover food, there is the option to take that to a pig farm. And we also want to put in the fact that there's a bit of a disclaimer about the licensing at a pig farm that schools can take to. If you have questions about that, we can go to that later. Excuse me. But then obviously composting is an option at a commercial facility. Maybe your school has a backyard program, but any of these 4 options keep that leftover food out of landfills and incinerators. Before we start talking about share tables, we do want to remind all of us that the first priority at school is for students to eat their breakfast, eat their lunch, drink their milk. Those are really important meals to the success of their day. And that's the primary concern. Once that goal has been met, we can start looking at some of the options that we can put in play to recover food. This young student right here, it looks like he didn't want his applesauce for the day, and so he's made the choice to put it in the share table, which in this case is the share bucket. And we wanted to give you the USDA guidelines on share tables, which they actually sent out a special memo on this topic just this past June. And we also want to say here that we're breaking one of the universal rules of PowerPoints, that you're not supposed to have more than 3 bullets on a slide. But this is important information, and we're going to be giving other guidelines coming up, and we wanted to make sure that you have the most up-to-date and the most current information, most complete information, so that you can share that with your community in case there are any questions about these practices. One of the things that surprised us is that the USDA is advocating for these food or beverage items to be donated to a nonprofit organization, so we were very happy to see that. As far as setting up share tables go, we found that the best setup is one that is easy and convenient. You'll notice here that the food share bucket on the left, it looks like a milk carton. That's right in line with the rest of the sorting station in the cafeteria. That makes it easy for a student coming through the line. It really makes a difference if the school communicates to their students why there's a share table, why there's a share bucket, and the important piece of the conversation is that your community is invested in the practice and they understand why they're doing it and what the impact is. And even a kindergartner can understand that by putting that food on the table instead of in the trash, that makes a big difference. So what's going on in the state of Maine? We had several conversations with Walter Beasley, who this is his area with the Maine DOE. His big point, which we put in red there, is that products that are sealed can be offered to other students at no cost. Open items must be discarded. And that pretty much sums up what you can do in a school at the share table. That gives you very clear limitations. One of the questions can often be about fruit. Oranges and bananas are obviously great examples of what can be put on the share table. We have known schools that did offer apples and pears, in a sharing table. But that's up to each school. Walter says that's up to a school's discretion to decide whether or not schools want to follow with anything other than oranges and bananas. The big question and the big criteria, I guess you could call it, is the product sealed? And that's your immediate answer, is it okay? Here you can see carrots, apple slices, orange slices, yogurt that comes in those small containers, milk, applesauce, anything that's sealed. Even sandwiches in a lot of cafeterias are wrapped sufficiently so that no one has touched it, and that makes it okay for the table. I think the benefits of share tables are pretty clear. What we like about share tables is that it's a very simple practice and the benefits are immediate within the school. But the one thing that we did want to point to is that it also introduces the idea into your community that sharing can make a real difference. That if you don't want the food, better to share it than put it in the trash. And we love this drawing. We love the fact that share tables might help kids think twice before wasting the food that they have on their tray. And we can't talk about share tables without talking about food insecurity. This is obviously another example of what a share table could look like. Food security is defined here by the USDA. I guess back in the day, we would talk about students being hungry. That language has now shifted into, does that student have consistent access to adequate food? And because there might be barriers to the fact that they cannot get consistent access to food. So now, We also wanted to share with you, this is what the picture of food insecurity looks like in the state of Maine for households and for children. Again, the fact that jumped out for us was nearly 1 in every 4 Maine children have food insecurity. And we are unfortunately first in New England in child food insecurity. We also took a look at what's happening in terms of free and reduced lunch, which can often be a measure of the level of poverty in a household or in a community. And as of 2016, nearly half of Maine K-12 students fell into that category. Here's a breakdown by county in the state. No county is immune to food insecurity. You can see that the numbers may vary, but every single county, regardless, is facing some level of children who are getting free or reduced lunch, sometimes in really staggering numbers of 60%. So when we want to talk about, and I'm going to jump back to, before I go on to offer versus serve, one thing we did want to say when we were talking to Walter Beasley is that he also advocated that if there's food left over on the share table after lunch, he thinks that it's entirely within the opportunity for a school nurse, for example, to collect that food and to bring it back to their office and say if a student comes in needing a snack, or if the school nurse happens to have information that would lead him or her to believe that that student might be needing food for the night or for the weekend, it is opportunity for school nurse to pack that leftover food into that child's backpack and send it home, which was a good thing. We wanted to share that with you. The other thing that we've been thinking about share tables is with that leftover food, there is some concern about whether things like milk, yogurt, cheese, some of the sliced fruits, they are perishables, and we were thinking that it might be a good idea to have refrigerators in schools. We've been talking a lot about whether we could get refrigerators, a donated refrigerator program set up for the future, so that schools would have the opportunity to keep this food and make it available even after the day or two, and that might make a difference. The other thing that Walter mentioned is that if you are concerned about food perishables, is you could put an ice pack into the sharing table or into that bucket, as you saw a couple schools have, so that you don't have to worry about food spoiling. So this is another way to prevent food waste, moving away from sharing tables. The USDA calls it offer versus serve. You can see here students taking food from a salad bar. And these are, again, USDA guidelines. And actually, interestingly, Walter Beasley also reiterated this, that the first initial goal of offer versus serve was to reduce food waste to school meal programs, and also giving students a chance to decline foods that they really didn't want to eat that day. Again, we're breaking that universal rule here and giving you more information than you need, but you're welcome to come back and review this after the webinar. I think Walter, again, sums it up very clearly. The state of Maine does support USDA Food and Nutrition Service guidelines. Students can take, or must take rather, 3 of the 5 options offered. One of them has to be the fruit or vegetable, a half cup of one or the other. And he did say something that was interesting, and we'd love to hear from some of the nutrition directors who are tuning in today. He said that this is an option for grades K through 12. We thought it was only an option for high school students in the state. And it's the food service director that makes the decision whether the district will decide to follow this option or not. But again, the impact is that it's keeping food out of the trash. Then we can't talk about leftover food without talking about donating food. This is actually could for any of you who are shopping at large stores like a Costco, this actually is a photo of the Good Shepherd Food Bank, and this is the volume of food that they're dealing with. If you are fortunate enough to have leftover food at your school, then we really encourage you to look into the option of donating food. And 5 years ago, the School Lunch Act was amended, as you can see, so that just like restaurants were protected by the Good Samaritan law, schools now have that same protection. So in the past 5 years, the picture of food donation policy has changed in a big way for schools. Again, more information than you probably need to know about the Good Samaritan Food Donation Act. It was passed back in '96, but this has really become a firewall for any organization, whether it's a restaurant, a supermarket, or a school that does want to donate food to a charitable organization. This sets the guidelines for your protection. And we did provide a link here. It's also in the back in the resources section. If you do want to donate, this is a list of all the food banks and food pantries around the state, so you can find one that's near your town. And we do want to mention when it comes to the sort of process of shared tables in a school, it's very different than having students share food at their table. I mean, if somebody has a sandwich that they don't want to eat and they decide to give it to their neighbor, schools really don't encourage that practice because of the high concern about allergies and so forth among different students. So shared tables are definitely a different practice than that sharing at the table. And again, we go back to that quote from the EPA administrator. All of these practices help to feed people instead of feeding landfills, which in our book is a good thing. So thanks. I'm going to turn it over to Martha now, who's going to talk about the other opportunity, which is collecting leftover food for composting.
So this actually is going to be the focus of our webinar number 2 next week, next Thursday on October 20th. Here, we're just going to go over what you should be thinking about if you're thinking about setting up a waste reduction program, including recycling and collecting food scraps for compost. So composting actually is like one of the last things on the hierarchy. It's the option right before a landfill, but nonetheless, it's not very well practiced in schools. I think, you know, schools are a huge source of waste and a very, I want to say an open market to tap into because they produce a steady stream of waste every day for 9 months. And they produce a lot of it. So we want to hear from you about whether you had any problems if you did try to set up a waste reduction program, or if you are practicing a waste reduction program. We want to hear from you about what problems you had, what barriers you faced, and how you got through those barriers. We are going to take your stories and post them or talk about them at our next webinar. You can either type your stories in the chat box, or you can email us at efc@maine.edu with your stories that we will feature next time. So why do we want to set up a waste reduction program? Some of the benefits that you will gain from a program such as that is obviously you will reduce your solid waste. And I'm not talking about 10%. I mean, you can reduce it up to 70 to 80% in the first week of your practice. We have a story about a school that produced 14 to 15 contractor bags a week of wet trash and started a program and immediately went to 2 or 3 per week. So that is a very visible benefit. It's also an opportunity to do some service learning right in school. You save money on the trash bags that the contractor bags are really expensive. and you model environmental stewardship. So the things to think about before setting up a program is, what are you going to, how are you going to set a foundation for a robust program? Well, you need to think about, what are your goals? How are you going to incentivize the student body to keep going with the program? And other things, like how are you going to train the student body? How are you going to get your story out to the community? We're going to focus on this next week in more detail, but those are just some of the things that you need to think about from the very beginning, before you launch. So to build a program's foundation, you need to sort of figure out, do you have in-house champions, and who are they? How are you going to tap into them? Also, how are you going to build a network of partners outside of your school, like with your municipality, with your trash hauler, with your compost hauler, with the goal of really setting up a robust program that is going to last? So to build a network of partners in the school and in the town, you can tap into your municipal government, Department of Public Works, composting haulers that can support your goals. Also in-house, you need to talk to the administrators, the students, the kitchen and custodial staff especially, and those teachers that are going to be the backbone of this. Even though it's a student-led program, it's the teachers who are there to figure out how to get beyond some problems. So to bring together the in-house champions is not an easy task. You're going to have to make sure food service staff is on board, custodial staff is on board, your administration is on board, and figure out how to, we say, passing the cake, because it's sort of a Herculean effort to do this. How are you going to pass the cake to the next generation of green team leaders, to the next generation of green team teachers and custodians, etc.? And what does success look like to you? There are all these goals that you can go for. You can just figure out, do we just want to start small and just do milk carton recycling? Or do we want to do a whole full-blown program? From experience, I can tell you it's probably easier to start a full-blown program. You'll see results quicker, and you won't have to figure out how to get to the next stage every time. You take advantage of 3 opportunities to get your program going. That is, create some buzz in the community about it. Get the word out of what you're doing. In your newsletter or your PTA newspaper, or you could send home a flyer with the students. You can also sell it to people internally by saying it is a service learning opportunity for every student in the school. There's obviously the classroom connection, the STEM connection that teachers may respond to. So green teams, great idea to have a green team. If you don't have a green team, it is something that you should consider starting, and they can be your best supporters to get this program going by, for one thing, training the entire student body on what to do. We've had green teams that put on little skits, led assemblies to teach the entire student body on what to do. There's also the STEM classroom connection. Obviously, this is the blue tarp exercise that it's a waste audit, actually. Call it the blue tarp exercise, where students look at 1 day's worth of what went into the trash, and then separate it and figure out how much of it is really, really trash. This is something that creates a lot of data if you want to use it in any of your science or math classes, and it's just a great way to integrate it into the curriculum. So how can you get the word out to your community and create a buzz? Well, Facebook, backpack mail, newsletter. Really what the point is that you need to figure out what your priorities are and goals are, and how much time you have to spend on doing what you want to do to reach your goal. You can concentrate on getting the word out of how much money you're saving by setting up a composting separation station. Or you can you can focus on the STEM curriculum and what that's adding to your student body. The goal here is just to be successful, and whether that's going, you know, focusing on one thing or focusing on 4 or 5 things, it doesn't matter as long as, you know, you keep that in mind that you just want to succeed. So before the launch, the few things to do is to contact some people. See if there's a recycling hauler that can handle additional recycling, because you will have a lot of additional recycling if you start a program like this. Most of the bulk that you will take out of the waste stream is from the recycling. You should also contact your waste hauler, because maybe they should have a heads up that you're going to have 80% less trash to haul. That's a good thing. And then before you set a launch date, make sure that all internal questions within the school or school district are addressed so that nobody is surprised. You know, staff concerns, custodial concerns, who's going to monitor this program, all these things you need to think about before you actually launch. You need to collect some equipment, you need to collect some baseline data, and you need to think about how your storage stations are going to look. You need to also think about how your school community will be trained. So data collection, like I said, you need a baseline. These, well, I will go through next time, next week in more detail, but it is really good to have a baseline to know where you started so that you can track your progress. And the last thing, I guess the most important thing, is to motivate the student body, motivate your community. How can you keep your community interested, and how can you keep your community interested long enough so that you see success? Well, there are lots of incentives, such as rewards, challenges, and there are lots of ways to do it. You can motivate, you know, homeroom sports teams, school clubs like the Green Teams, the students should be very clear about goals and sharing their results. So what are the goals that you can go for? Well, you can have a goal to reduce the number of trash bags per day by a certain date, like a month from now. Are we going to have the same amount of trash bags, or are we going to try to reduce them? School dumpsters, you know, lots of schools have 2-3 dumpsters just for mainly cafeteria trash. We've seen instances where that dumpster can be reduced to just one dumpster, maybe replaced by a recycling dumpster instead of just waste dumpsters. And you can set a goal to sort of go for that goal within, they say, 2-3 months. Also, you can set a goal to challenge the students to have contaminant-free compost, which is really, really hard, for just one day, and see what happens. And then maybe move to a week, and then maybe move to 2 weeks, and so on. There was one challenge that a teacher gave to a student that I just want to relay. A student in, I think it was 2nd grade, had to carry around her garbage, her trash, that she produced for an entire week in her backpack. And that showed the students very clearly how much trash they produce, and that was a great motivator. So this is just an example of a challenge. Sports teams were challenged to be the best monitors during the food separation process, and this is just what it looks like. They did this in their cafeteria so that everybody could see the progress. You can also set up rewards like certificates to local restaurants. One school did a golden recycling bucket of which classroom did the best job recycling in the classrooms, and that classroom would get the gold bucket. And it was very well received. The students looked very much forward to it. Here are some school resources that we want to tell you about, and I'm going to hand it over to Susan because she put these together and can speak more in detail about them.
Thanks, Martha. So we're getting towards the end of the webinar. We just want to talk about these resources, and I've been looking over the questions that have come in. We really appreciate everybody sharing their thoughts and questions. We'll get to that after going through this list very quickly. Do want to apologize to school representatives and who are calling in from outside of Maine's area. Maine does offer a school recycling grant program. The deadline is coming right up, Halloween, which they said that's always a good date for schools to remember. And here's the information, the links, and the website to get the application and to learn more about it. We would love to hear from people in other towns across the state. Do you know of other places that are offering grants, or how do you get funding for your program? Unfortunately, Maine doesn't have a program in place that does provide funding through the state for these kinds of costs to set up stations for collecting compost and so forth. We know of other states where that is an option. So please, if you know of grant opportunities, please let us know, and we can share those with the rest of our network here today. And these next two slides give you just a quick roundup of some of the resources out there. Again, we would love it if you sent in any resource information that you would like to share with the group. We do want to put a spotlight on the first one. Again, that's the training resources for school cafeteria recycling and composting. Those are PowerPoints and training prezzies that we put together for a workshop we held last year. Those are still available on the New England EFC website, and they can be helpful if your school is looking for training, some kind of a media training for your students. They can be adapted to fit your community as well. Going into this slide talks about some of the opportunities that EPA and USDA offer. The Ugly Fruit and Vegetable Campaign is a great website just because the graphics are great and the statistics are fun, but it's also talking about a pretty serious issue in the produce market. And we did mention the Green Schools Initiative and the Green Schools National Network. If your school is really invested in becoming a model of sustainability, then these two programs allow you to follow a series of steps to become certified, great information about green team projects, definitely worthwhile. And we mentioned the Carton Council. If they got in touch with us hearing about the work that we've been doing, if your goal is to start out just with milk cartons, they offer some great resources about how to get started, and we wanted to include that, even if you're looking at collecting leftover food maybe down the road. And again, we'll be here next week, same time, same login information. Next Thursday, we'll have part 2 of this webinar series, and then we'll be focusing strictly on composting and all the nuts and bolts and gritty details of putting together a composting station at your school. So if you are around, please tune in, please register if you haven't yet. And again, as we invited you earlier, we would love it if you sent us your ideas and solutions to the problems that your school faced. We'd love to know how you solved them. Based on the experience we had in schools, we had some observations to make, but we would love to just have as long a list as possible, because every time you have a problem, it's good to have at least 2 or 3 solutions to match up with it. And we'd be happy to include them in next week's webinar. So that's our webinar for today. We do have some time for questions, and I know that our assistant, Pang, from the Muskie School has been collecting the questions, and we appreciate everybody sending them in so we can get started on looking at those. I did want to start off with one that I noticed, and I think it was someone who said that their food inspector said that share tables were not allowed. If you could just send us the information about, is your school in Maine or are you out of state? We just wanted to clarify that before we answer you're in Maine. If you wanted to share that information, store with the information from Walter Beasley or have your inspector call Walter Beasley. Share tables are a legitimate opportunity in a school cafeteria, obviously with the limitations that we talked about. And where is the food inspector out of? Okay, and is that through, do you know what agency or what bureau? That might be helpful to know as well. We did find when we started working in schools that there was a lot of misconceptions about share tables, and what we found is that it just took one person in a school to raise doubts about whether or not it was okay to leave leftover food out for other students to take at no cost. And just planting that one seed of doubt sometimes could bring a program to a halt. So that's why we've gone into so much detail today and provided so much documentation, so that if there are any questions in your school, please share that information with everybody there and let them know that this is a real opportunity. So thank you, Storm, for bringing that up. And please let us know if there's any other way we can help out to clear up those misconceptions.
Okay, so we have another question. How do schools deal with overcoming stigmas that might be associated with students who might take from the share table? So I can tell you what I've seen and heard people tell me about share tables. What I've seen directly is that at the grammar school level, K through 5, what happens in a situation where there is a share table is I did not sense that there was any shame in going up and taking that extra food. Usually what you saw were like the 5th grader boys that were really big that came back for an extra milk. And it was not a table of shame. It was more like, oh, I need another milk and I don't want to pay for it. So that's just one instance. I know that there is definitely the chance that, you know, somebody would be embarrassed to go take food from a share table. But here's another instance of how it can work. What can also happen is that the share table gets laden with, say, bananas and oranges and milk and yogurts 1 lunch hour. And what happens a lot of times is either the nurse takes it to have in her office for kids that come and need something to eat, or teachers take turns taking it back to their classrooms. And they can set up a system of, you know, this teacher takes it this day, this teacher takes it the next day, and so forth. And they use it for snacks, especially in the lower grades, like the K through 3rd is what I've seen happen. Another thing that can solve the problem is that the food that is left on the share table gets stored until the end of the week, and then the nurse or someone like the counselor would take the food and actually fill backpacks and send it home with certain kids. This is at the end of the day when really no one's looking, and so that can be some sort of anonymity around it. That's what I've seen, so I hope that's useful. Hold on, we lost our questions. Okay, next question is, finding a composter that will also take compostable ware is difficult. Urban settings in particular are using low solid anaerobic digestion, which supposedly do tolerate materials other than napkins, food scraps, etc. So I agree. Yeah, compostable ware is difficult. It's also very expensive. I don't know how many schools are using it. And we'll get into that more next week. We'll find out more information on that. But yes, most industrial compost haulers have a hard time with that. And especially if you're doing backyard composting, it becomes even more difficult. It just doesn't break down very well. We'll address that next week. Thank you for your question.
I wanted to mention, someone had signed in with a question about fruit fly infestations. And I wasn't sure if that was a question or not, but that's something that we're going to be, would be definitely be considered a problem or a barrier. Along with odor, fruit flies are right up there in the top 5. So we will definitely be looking at that next week. If people have had, any experience with solving the fruit fly problems in cafeterias, please let us know. So thank you for that question.
The next question is, I was told that as long as I didn't leave yogurt, milk, or anything perishable, that the share table was okay. Even those perishables, yogurt, milk, anything that's sealed is okay, as long as it is stored so that it doesn't go bad, like we mentioned, like a bowl with ice in it, low tech. Just put that on the share table, and that can keep it from going bad. I mean, the best solution is to have a little refrigerator to store it in, but that, of course, is sometimes not doable.
And as we mentioned earlier, when I talked to, again, I keep coming back to Walter, but he is definitely the source of all information on share tables as far as the DOE is concerned. And he did mention that small dorm refrigerators, if schools did choose to go towards the refrigeration option, small dorm refrigerators would not be considered effective because they might not be able to keep the food cold for a long enough period of time. So he was looking for something that was on a larger scale. So I did want to mention that.
So has anyone worked with TerraCycle for packaging waste? We did have some issues with juice box collection. So the TerraCycle are those Capri Sun packs, juice pouches that can't be composted and can't be recycled. I think they ask people to send it back to, Susan, are you more aware of that?
Oh, I was just going to say that when our Maine is our reference here in the southern part of the state, and in some areas the Capri juice pouches are recyclable, but Maine is not equipped to take them. And so therefore a lot of schools in this area, in that Maine member community area, do turn to TerraCycle as an option. And we saw many schools having sort of a separate collection box for those. But is your question, have other schools had experience with them? If you have, I think that this it would be good to pass that along, and we can share that information about what other schools had that kind of experience.
There was a question about can schools donate to food pantries? I believe that was the question. Can food pantries get food from schools? So we were just at an excellent food recovery conference at Harvard Law School a couple of months ago, and I heard some really amazing stories about how if schools have like trays of uneaten food, like big trays of mac and cheese or whatever, then that's okay to donate. And I heard stories about how colleges were donating these untapped, the trays can't be tapped into, they need to be full trays of food that just have not been used yet. And if those are frozen, then yes, those can be donated to food banks. I hope I understood your question correctly. Any more?
And I think that this is, someone had mentioned, Doug, you mentioned time being a factor as far as setting up a successful sorting system. We have found that two of the barriers for successful whether it's collecting recyclables or collecting leftover food or both. And the conference that Martha mentioned, where there were teachers and staff from all over the country had come together to talk about these kinds of practices. Two of the barriers that unfortunately, I don't know what kind of control you might have at school, but two of the barriers were not enough time and the fact that students spent most of their school lunch waiting in line to get food. First, then they would get food, sit down and eat quickly, and then come back to put food, originally in the trash, but now they're being introduced with an additional task. So that's a barrier of time that that's school lunch policy, and we kept hearing people talk about how they would bump up against that over and over again. The second thing was also the fact that a lot of schools, kids go to lunch before they go to recess, and so that was contributing to food waste because after recess, it's, as you can imagine, kids were a lot hungrier than before recess. And sometimes the way a school's schedule is set up, they can't accommodate school lunch after recess, and their studies have been done that show that when that sequence is reversed, kids eat more, and that definitely means that the amount of food waste that's left over definitely drops. So I definitely we understand the situation that your students are facing. I think we can talk a little bit about that next week. Sometimes you can set up your system so that it's a little more efficient, and there are a few ways to do that. But again, I understand you're working on a fixed amount of time, and putting in a sorting system, you're eating up more of their precious lunchtime that students are already feel tight about. So anyway, I hope that helps. Let's get started on that, and we can definitely talk more about that. If anyone else has had experience with how they manage the short time frame, I mean, we all feel, Martha and I feel pretty strongly that the amount of time that kids have to eat is crazy short, and so it definitely contributes to sometimes a really rushed shift.
A question came in about green teams. What is the optimal size for a green team? So that depends on what level you're talking about, grammar, middle, or high school. It's really, really hard to get a robust high school green team going. I don't think I've ever seen a high school green team of more than, a handful of motivated kids. That's the level that is the hardest. I'd say middle school is a great time to capture kids in a green team. They are still open to new ideas. They are excited about doing new things, and we've seen that they are doers. They can get things done. And I don't want to say that grammar school kids can't do it. They are awesome at being in green teams. I've seen a green team that had 100, I think it was 105 students. I'd say that's a little too big, but I don't want to say that it shouldn't be that big. I just think it's kind of hard to do specific projects with that many kids. I've also seen green teams of like just 2 kids. It's really sad. But I would say like an optimal size for having a green team that can actually, train the student body, do some activities around recycling, motivate the program to go forward, do the data collecting. I would say probably around 20, 25 is a really great number.
And it allows for kids to step in and step out according to what kind of time they might have. But we have found, other than the number of kids that might be in that green team or environmental club, sometimes one of the other things that is daunting is to come up with projects for the green team to actually undertake in the school. And so we usually recommend that if schools are interested in doing some kind of a sorting program in the cafeteria, that it was a great project to guide the green teams or the environmental clubs toward that effort, because it provides the passion and the motivation and the sort of the student support. A lot of times students will take more interest in a program that's initiated by other students rather than one that started from the top down. So sometimes that can be helpful in getting started. And I just wanted to mention very quickly here, someone from Cambridge was talking, making a second reference about serviceware, reusable utensils, plates, and so forth. That's something, again, we can talk more about next week. I do want to say that when we were working on our pilot program, we were very fortunate to get a donation from the Hudamaki company, who's up in Waterville. They make a molded fiber plate. It's recyclable and compostable, and we had great success with that product. I don't know who you've investigated, but maybe someone else has done some research on some serviceware that was recyclable/compostable. We'd love to hear about it, and maybe we could talk more. It sounds like that Cambridge is looking for some opportunities now that you've banned styrofoam. And that's one thing we also want to talk about too, is how many schools that are listening in today, how many schools still have styrofoam trays in their lunchroom? That was one thing that we were able to use the savings from the hauling costs, changes in hauling costs, to invest in recyclable plates and get rid of our styrofoam once and for all, which was a huge event and a great thing to celebrate. Getting rid of styrofoam just made everybody happy. So we can talk more about serviceware next week, but we'd love to hear your thoughts. Thanks so much, that's a great question.
We need to wrap up now, and I just wanted to remind you that we will be, again, doing our part 2 of this webinar series next Thursday, 3:30 to 4:30. And in the meantime, we would very much appreciate your stories that we can feature, and any comments or suggestions on what you'd like to hear next time. We'd appreciate it a lot. So thank you very much.